I never thought my own son would call me crazy in front of a restaurant full of strangers. That Sunday morning at Harbor View Café, I was simply trying to explain why I'd been crying earlier when Emory snapped. "Mom, you're being completely irrational about this. You're acting crazy." The words hit harder than the coastal wind that had been battering Bellmare all week. 67 years of careful living, 35 years of single motherhood, and 4 decades of putting his needs before mine, reduced to one dismissive word. I watched the other diners glance over with that familiar mixture of pity and discomfort people reserve for difficult, older women. But something shifted in me that morning. Something I hadn't felt since I was young and fierce and unafraid. What would happen if I stopped being the good, quiet mother and finally told my truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of my bedroom window, casting familiar shadows across the hardwood floors I'd polished for 30 years. I pressed my feet against the cool planks and took inventory of my life the way I'd taught my students to analyze literature, looking for themes, patterns, moments of significance that might have been overlooked on first reading. My small cottage on Seaview Lane had been home since Emory was 7 years old. I'd bought it with the settlement money from my divorce, choosing this quiet street 3 blocks from the ocean because I could afford the mortgage on a teacher's salary, and because the sound of waves helped me sleep through those early years of single motherhood. The house still held traces of those decades. Crayon marks on the kitchen doorframe where I'd measured Emory's height each birthday. A chip in the living room baseboard from when he'd crashed his bicycle into the wall. The bedroom that had served as his nursery, then his childhood sanctuary, then his teenage refuge, before he left for college and never really came back. I made my coffee in the same blue ceramic mug I'd used for 20 years, a gift from my students during my final year, teaching at Bellmare High. "World's best teacher," it proclaimed in fading gold letters, though some mornings I wondered if they'd meant it, or if it was just the kind of thing teenagers said to their favorite teachers before forgetting them entirely. The kitchen table was scattered with the detritus of my retirement. Bills organized in neat piles, a half-finished crossword puzzle, and 3 notebooks filled with observations about life in Bellmare that I'd been collecting for months, without any clear purpose. I'd always been a documenter, someone who noticed the small details that others missed. Maybe it came from years of grading student essays, searching for the buried insights beneath surface observations. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I'd spent so many years listening to other people's stories that I'd forgotten I had one of my own worth telling. The phone rang as I settled into my morning routine of reading the local paper and checking email on the laptop Emory had grudgingly helped me set up 2 Christmases ago. It was Mo, my closest friend since we'd bonded over terrible coffee in the faculty lounge 30 years earlier. "Iris, honey, how are you feeling after yesterday?" Her voice carried that careful gentleness people use when they're not sure how fragile you might be. Yesterday, the scene at Harbor View Café played in my mind like a film reel I couldn't stop. I'd been explaining to Emory and his wife, Bee, why I'd been emotional lately, how I'd been feeling invisible, how his monthly duty calls felt perfunctory, how I sometimes went days without meaningful human conversation. My voice had cracked when I mentioned that I'd been considering getting a dog for companionship, and tears had started falling before I could stop them. "I'm fine," I told Mo, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's just difficult when your own child treats you like you're becoming senile because you have feelings." Mo made the snorting sound she reserved for her strongest disapproval. "That boy has always been too impressed with his own logic. Takes after his father in that regard. She wasn't wrong. Emory had inherited Richard's talent for making emotions seem like character flaws. My ex-husband had spent our entire marriage treating my sensitivity like a personal inconvenience, something to be managed rather than understood. I'd hoped raising Emory alone would spare him from that particular form of emotional myopia. But somewhere along the way, he'd absorbed the lesson that feelings were weakness and rational thought was virtue. "I keep thinking about something," I said, stirring my coffee, though it didn't need stirring. "Remember when I used to write those little observations about our students? The ones you said I should turn into a book?" "The character sketches. Those were brilliant, Iris. You had such insight into what made those kids tick." "I've been writing again. Not about students, just about life. About Emory. About being a mother. About getting older in a world that seems to have less and less patience for women like me." Mo was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her cats moving around in the background. She'd retired from the library 3 years ago and had thrown herself into online poetry communities and book clubs with the enthusiasm of someone finally free to pursue her passions. "What kind of writing?" she asked carefully. Honest writing. The kind I never had the courage to do when I was worried about being professional or appropriate or not embarrassing anyone. "Iris," Mo said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "That sounds exactly like the kind of writing the world needs more of." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the newest of my notebooks. My handwriting looked different. Somehow, more confident than it had in years. I'd been documenting small moments of disrespect, subtle put-downs, the gradual erosion of my relationship with my son. At first, I'd told myself it was just therapeutic, a way to process my feelings. But lately, I'd been wondering if these observations might serve a larger purpose. I thought about my former students, now adults scattered across the country, many of them parents themselves. I thought about the women my age who moved through Bellmare like ghosts, polite and invisible, their voices growing quieter each year as the world grew louder around them. I thought about yesterday's humiliation and how Emory had seemed genuinely puzzled by my emotional response, as if my tears were an overreaction to his perfectly reasonable assessment of my mental state. The notebook lay open to an entry I'd written the week before. "Emory called today to cancel our dinner plans. 3rd time this month. He doesn't apologize anymore, just states the facts, as if my disappointment is unreasonable. I wonder when I became someone whose time wasn't worth respecting." My phone buzzed with a text message. Emory, as if summoned by my thoughts. "Mom, hope you're feeling better today. Maybe we should talk about finding you someone to talk to, a professional. I worry about you being alone so much." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'm not broken, honey. I just have feelings about things that matter to me." His response came quickly. "I know, but maybe some objective perspective would help. Objective perspective. As if my own experience of my life somehow lacked credibility. As if the woman who had raised him, supported him, sacrificed for him, needed a stranger to validate her emotional responses." I closed the notebook and walked to my computer. For months, I'd been reading blogs and online memoirs, marveling at the courage of people who shared their most vulnerable truths with the world. I'd always assumed that kind of honesty was for younger people, for those who'd grown up with social media and had never learned to keep their private thoughts private. But sitting there in my quiet kitchen, with the morning light growing stronger and the sound of waves carrying through my windows, I realized that maybe it was exactly my generation that needed to start speaking up. Maybe we'd been quiet long enough. I opened a new document and began typing. My son called me crazy for crying, so I decided to show the world what he'd done. The words appeared on the screen with startling clarity, as if they'd been waiting inside me for years. I kept typing, letting the story pour out. Not just about yesterday's incident, but about the pattern of dismissal, the gradual erosion of respect, the way emotional intelligence had been rebranded as instability somewhere along the way. When I finally stopped, I had 3 pages of raw, honest observation about motherhood, aging, and the particular loneliness of being dismissed by the person you love most. It wasn't polished or careful or appropriate. It was true. I saved the document with a simple title, Chapter 1, The Day My Son Called Me Crazy. Then I researched how to start a blog. The blog platform asked me to choose a name for my site. I sat staring at the cursor blinking in the empty field, trying to find words that captured what I was attempting to do. Iris Speaks seemed too simple. A Mother's Truth felt melodramatic. Finally, I typed, Late Bloomer, One Woman's Second Act, and clicked save before I could second-guess myself. The interface looked intimidating at first, with its arrays of buttons and customization options. But I focused on the basics. Clean, simple design. A brief description. The unfiltered thoughts of a 67-year-old woman who's finally ready to tell her truth. And then I posted my first entry. I hit publish before I could lose my nerve. Then immediately closed the laptop and spent the rest of the day reorganizing my already organized closets. That evening I checked the site expecting to find 0 readers and maybe 1 spam comment. Instead, I found 17 views and 3 comments from strangers. This is so relatable, wrote someone named Margot in Maine. Thank you for putting words to something I've felt but couldn't express. My daughter does the same thing to me, added Grandma Jean 72. When did our emotions become inconvenient? The 3rd comment was longer, from someone with the username Quiet Revolution. I'm 45 and already seeing how the world treats my mother differently as she ages. Your honesty is a gift. Please keep writing. I read the comments 3 times, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. The sense that my words mattered. To someone other than myself. I'd spent decades encouraging my students to find their voices, to write with courage and authenticity, but I'd never fully understood the intoxicating power of being heard until that moment. Over the next week, I fell into a routine. Morning coffee, local news, then writing. I posted every few days, always raw entries about my experiences with Emory, but also broader observations about aging, about being a woman in a youth-obsessed culture, about the particular challenges of maintaining dignity when the world seems determined to render you invisible. My readership grew slowly but steadily. 20 views became 50, then 100. The comments section became a gathering place for women sharing similar stories. I began to recognize regular readers, people who left thoughtful responses, and seemed genuinely invested in my journey. Mo stopped by on Friday afternoon, as had become our tradition since retirement. She brought wine and her latest poetry printouts, but I could tell she had something specific on her mind. I read your blog, she said without preamble, settling into the kitchen chair across from me. My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about it, not even Mo. How did you find it? Jules Nakayama shared it on their social media. You remember Jules took my poetry workshop last year? They wrote this beautiful post about how your words helped them understand their own grandmother better. Mo studied my face. Iris, honey, you have over 300 followers now. Did you know that? I hadn't checked the statistics in 2 days, afraid of what I might find. 300 people reading my private thoughts felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. What did you think? I asked. Mo reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I think you're finally writing like the person I've always known you to be. Brave and honest and absolutely unwilling to accept bullshit. She paused. I also think Emory is going to lose his mind when he finds out. The thought had occurred to me, of course. My son worked in media, spent his days crafting carefully curated content for his podcast network. The idea of his mother airing family grievances online would horrify him on multiple levels. But for the first time in years, his potential disapproval didn't make me want to retreat. Let him be upset, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I've spent 35 years protecting his comfort at the expense of my own truth. Mew grinned. There she is. There's the woman who used to terrify school board members when they tried to cut the arts budget. That weekend I posted an entry about emotional labor, how I'd spent decades managing not just my own feelings but everyone else's, smoothing over conflicts, making excuses for other people's behavior, absorbing blame to maintain peace. I wrote about the exhaustion of being the family's emotional caretaker, while being simultaneously dismissed as too emotional, when I finally reached my breaking point. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in from women sharing their own stories of thankless emotional labor, of being called dramatic or sensitive or crazy when they dared to express frustration. Many mentioned their adult children, the painful realization that the people they'd raised had absorbed society's devaluation of women's emotional intelligence. By Monday morning, my blog had been shared on several larger platforms. A parenting blog called Midlife Truths had featured my emotional labor post, and my follower count had jumped to over 1,000. My email inbox contained messages from readers, interview requests from small podcasts, and one note that made me sit down, hard in my kitchen chair. It was from Thomas Varelli, a name I recognized immediately, though I hadn't seen him in 15 years. He'd been one of my students during my final years of teaching, a quiet kid who'd shown real promise as a writer. Dear Mrs. Calloway, the email began. I hope you remember me from your AP English class. I've been following your blog since a friend shared it, and I wanted you to know how much your writing has moved me. You were the teacher who taught me that good writing requires absolute honesty, and you're demonstrating that lesson beautifully now. I work as a literary agent now, and I'd love to talk with you about your work. Would you be interested in a phone call? I read the email 3 times before it fully registered. A literary agent, wanting to talk about my work. The teenage boy who used to write passionate essays about social justice was now offering to help me share my story with an even wider audience. I was still staring at the email when my phone rang. Emory's name appeared on the screen, and I knew immediately that he'd discovered the blog. Mom. His voice was tight with controlled anger. We need to talk. Hello, sweetheart. How are you? I'm confused, honestly. B showed me something online that I'm hoping you can explain. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. Are you writing a blog about our family? He asked finally. I'm writing about my life, yes. Mom, this is... He struggled for words. This is incredibly inappropriate. You're sharing private family matters with strangers on the internet. The familiar guilt began rising in my chest, the automatic impulse to apologize and retreat. But I thought about the women who'd found comfort in my words, about Thomas's email, about the voice I'd finally found after decades of silence. I'm sharing my truth, I said quietly. My experiences as your mother, as a woman, as someone who's spent too many years being told her feelings don't matter. Your truth? Mom, you're making me look like some kind of monster. You're taking private conversations and twisting them to make yourself look like a victim. The word victim hung in the air between us. I realized this was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for. The confrontation I'd been both dreading and anticipating. I'm not twisting anything, Emory. I'm simply describing what happened and how it felt to experience it. But you're only telling your side of the story. What about context? What about the fact that I worry about you living alone? That I want what's best for you? What you want for me and what's best for me might be two different things. He was quiet for a long moment. I think you should take the blog down before this gets out of hand. No. The word came out clearer and stronger than I'd expected. No apology, no equivocation, no attempt to soften the refusal. No? Emory's voice climbed slightly. Mom, be reasonable. This affects more than just you. You're right, I said. It affects every woman who's been called crazy for having feelings. Every mother who's been dismissed by her own children. Every person who's been told their truth is inconvenient. I paused, feeling the strength of my conviction. I'm not taking it down, honey. I'm just getting started. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, chosen my own voice over my son's comfort. It was the most frightening and liberating thing I'd done in decades. I opened my laptop and began writing my next post. When your own child tries to silence you. The truth, I was learning, had a momentum all its own. The next 2 weeks brought a flurry of activity I wasn't prepared for. My blog readership exploded after several major parenting websites picked up my story. Late Bloomer was getting thousands of views daily, and my email inbox overflowed with messages from readers sharing their own experiences of being dismissed by family members. I'd agreed to a phone call with Thomas Varelli, and his enthusiasm about my writing both thrilled and overwhelmed me. Now a successful literary agent in Portland, he spoke with the same passionate intensity I remembered from his teenage years, though his focus had shifted from changing the world through fiction to helping real people tell their stories. Mrs. Calloway, may I call you Iris? What you've tapped into is something powerful, he said during our first conversation. There's a whole generation of women who've been told to be grateful, to be quiet, to accept dismissal as natural aging. You're giving them permission to speak up. I'm just writing about my life, I protested, though I was beginning to understand that my personal story had somehow become representative of something larger. The best memoirs always feel personal and universal at the same time, Thomas said. Have you considered expanding this into a book? I think publishers would be very interested. A book. The idea seemed surreal. I'd been a literature teacher for 40 years, had recommended thousands of books to students, had dreamed occasionally of writing one myself someday. But I'd always imagined that someday would involve careful planning, extensive research, years of deliberate preparation, not raw blog posts written in grief and anger at my kitchen table. I don't know if I have enough material for a whole book, I said. Trust me, you do. What you're documenting, the subtle dismissal of older women, the way families gaslight mothers, who dare to have needs, that's a book-length exploration, and your voice is perfect for it. Honest without being bitter, sad without being self-pitying. After we hung up, I sat staring at my laptop screen, trying to process the possibility that my late-night writing sessions might become something more substantial. The blog had given me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since retirement. But a book felt like claiming space in the world in a way I'd never dared. My phone rang constantly now. Podcasts wanting interviews, online magazines requesting articles, local news outlets asking for comment about the blogging grandmother who's going viral. I turned down most requests, overwhelmed by the attention, and unsure how to navigate suddenly being a public figure. Emory called twice more, each conversation more strained than the last. He'd recruited B to speak with me, hoping his wife might be able to reason with me in a way he couldn't. "Iris," B said when she called on a Thursday afternoon, "I want you to know that I understand why you're writing. I really do. But Emory is struggling with this. He feels like his privacy has been violated." I liked B. She was thoughtful and artistic, taught middle school art with genuine passion for helping kids express themselves. But she was also loyal to her husband, and I could hear the careful diplomacy in her voice. "What about my privacy?" I asked. "I spent 35 years keeping his secrets, making excuses for his behavior, protecting his image. When do I get to tell my side of the story?" "I'm not saying you don't have the right," B said carefully. "I'm just wondering if there might be a way to work this out privately, as a family." We tried that for decades. Every time I tried to express hurt or disappointment, I was told I was being too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. This is what happens when someone finally stops being quiet. After I hung up, I felt the familiar guilt creeping in. B was a good person trying to keep her family together. Emory was my son, and despite everything, I loved him fiercely. Maybe I was being selfish, airing our problems publicly instead of handling them privately like a mature adult should. But then I checked my email and found a message that stopped those doubts cold. "Dear Iris," it began. "My name is Jennifer, and I'm 52 years old. I've been reading your blog religiously since my sister shared it. Yesterday, for the first time in my life, I stood up to my teenage son when he called me psycho for asking him to help with housework. I told him that dismissing women's feelings was not acceptable, and that I deserved respect in my own home. He actually apologized. I wanted you to know that your courage is rippling out in ways you might not realize. Thank you for teaching me that I don't have to accept disrespect just because it's coming from someone I love." I read the message 3 times, tears blurring my vision. This was why I couldn't stop writing. Why the discomfort of my family members felt less important than the possibility of reaching women who needed to hear that their feelings mattered. Mo stopped by that evening with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, settling into what had become her unofficial role as my unofficial publicist and emotional support system. "Have you seen the comments on your latest post?" she asked, pulling containers from the bag. I had. My piece about the emotional labor of holidays, how I'd spent decades orchestrating perfect family gatherings while being criticized for caring too much about details, had generated hundreds of responses from women sharing similar experiences. "It's overwhelming sometimes," I admitted. "All these people expecting me to have answers, to be some kind of expert on family dysfunction." "You're not an expert," Mo said, uncorking the wine. "You're just someone brave enough to say what everyone else is thinking. That's different, and it's more valuable." We ate in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of decades of friendship. Mo had been there through my divorce, through Emory's difficult teenage years, through the loneliness of early retirement. She understood better than anyone how significant this late-life emergence felt. "Thomas thinks I should write a book," I said eventually. Mo nearly choked on her wine. "A book? Iris, that's incredible." It's terrifying. I don't know anything about writing books. I don't know if I'm qualified to speak for anyone other than myself. You're not speaking for anyone else, Mo said firmly. You're speaking as yourself, and that's exactly what makes it powerful. You think Alice Walker knew she was qualified to write about being a black woman in the South? You think Joan Didion worried about her credentials before writing about grief? The qualification is having lived it, and having the courage to tell the truth about it. That night, I lay in bed thinking about courage and qualifications, about the difference between speaking for others and speaking truthfully about your own experience. I thought about the teenage students I taught, how I'd encourage them to write fearlessly about their lives, to trust that their perspectives mattered. Maybe it was time to take my own advice. The next morning, I started outlining what a book might look like. Not just about Emory and our family dynamics, but about the broader experience of being an older woman in a culture that preferred us quiet and grateful. About the subtle ways emotional manipulation worked in families. About the cost of keeping peace at the expense of truth. As I worked, my phone rang. An unknown number with a Portland area code. Is this Iris Calloway? The voice was young, energetic, female. Yes, this is Iris. Hi. My name is Jules Nakayama. I'm a college student, and I've been following your blog since the beginning. I actually shared your first post on my social media because it reminded me so much of my own grandmother's experience. Jules. Mo had mentioned them. The student from her poetry workshop who'd helped spread my writing to a younger audience. I hope that was okay, Jules continued. I wanted to ask, would you be interested in doing a video interview? I have a small YouTube channel where I talk about intergenerational relationships and social justice issues. I think your story would really resonate with my audience. A video interview. The idea of appearing on camera, of being seen as well as heard, felt like crossing yet another threshold I wasn't sure I was ready for. I don't know much about YouTube, I said honestly. That's okay. We could do it over video call, really casual. Just two people talking about family, respect, and finding your voice. What do you think? I thought about Jennifer, the woman who'd stood up to her son after reading my blog. I thought about all the messages from women who felt less alone because I'd been willing to share my truth. Yes, I said before I could talk myself out of it. Let's do it. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table feeling the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that had become my constant companion. 6 months ago, I'd been a quiet retiree whose biggest decision was which library book to read next. Now, I was planning a book and agreeing to video interviews, becoming someone I'd never imagined I could be. The blog had started as a response to one humiliating moment with my son, but it was becoming something larger. A second act I'd never known I wanted, a voice I'd spent decades learning how to use. I opened my laptop and began writing. Chapter 8. The day I stopped apologizing for taking up space. The video interview with Jules took place on a sunny Tuesday morning, and despite my nervousness about appearing on camera, our conversation flowed naturally. Jules had a gift for asking thoughtful questions without pushing too hard, and their genuine curiosity about intergenerational dynamics helped me articulate things I'd been feeling but hadn't fully understood. What surprises me most about your story, Jules said near the end of our hour-long conversation, is how universal it feels. I've shared clips with friends, and everyone recognizes some version of this dynamic in their own families. Can you talk about that? I adjusted my laptop angle, still getting used to seeing my own face on screen. I think we've created a culture where emotional intelligence is devalued, especially in women, especially as we age. We're told that caring deeply about relationships is somehow immature or unstable, but healthy relationships require emotional awareness. They require the ability to express needs and boundaries. And when older women try to express those needs, we're labeled difficult, dramatic, crazy. The word still stung, even months after Emory had used it. There's this assumption that we should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention we receive from our families, that setting boundaries or expressing hurt feelings is somehow ungracious. The interview was posted that Friday and viewed over 10,000 times in the first week. Comments poured in from viewers of all ages, many sharing their own family stories. More significantly, several media outlets picked up clips from the conversation, and I started receiving calls from producers at larger platforms. Thomas was thrilled by the attention, seeing it as perfect timing for the book proposal he'd been crafting. This is exactly the kind of platform publishers want to see, he told me during one of our weekly check-ins. You're not just writing a memoir anymore, Iris. You're starting a conversation. But the increased visibility came with a cost. Emory's anger had evolved into something colder and more concerning. He'd stopped calling altogether, and when I reached out to him, his responses were brief and formal. B had tried to mediate, but I could tell the situation was putting strain on their marriage. More troubling were the anonymous messages I'd started receiving. Comments on the blog and emails questioning my motives, accusing me of exploiting my son for attention, suggesting I was an ungrateful mother who didn't deserve his care. Most came from accounts with fake names and no profile pictures. But their vitriol felt personal and targeted. Mo found me crying over my laptop one Thursday afternoon, overwhelmed by a particularly vicious email suggesting I was a narcissist who was destroying her family for internet fame. "Honey, you have to stop reading those," she said, pulling up a chair beside me. Anonymous trolls always come out when women start speaking truth. It means you're hitting a nerve. But what if they're right? I asked. What if I am being selfish? What if I'm destroying my relationship with my son just to feel important? Mo was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd known me for 30 years. "Do you feel important?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "When you write, when you share your story, when you read comments from women who say your words help them, do you feel important, or do you feel useful?" I considered this. The blog had given me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years, but it wasn't the shallow gratification of fame or attention. It was the deeper satisfaction of contributing something meaningful, of helping other people feel less alone. "Useful," I said finally. "I feel useful." "That's the difference," Mo said. "Narcissists want attention for its own sake. You want connection, understanding, change. You're not writing to make yourself feel important. You're writing because the work itself is important." Her words helped, but the criticism still stung. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to be a good mother, a good teacher, a good woman. Having my motives questioned by strangers felt like having my core identity attacked. The situation with Emory reached a breaking point the following week when I received a certified letter from an attorney. My son was threatening legal action if I continued writing about him without his consent. The letter cited privacy laws and suggested that my blog posts constituted harassment and defamation. I sat in my kitchen reading the legal language, feeling small and frightened in a way I hadn't since the early days of my divorce. Richard had used lawyers then too, wielding the threat of litigation to try to control me. I'd backed down then, settled for less than I deserved, chosen peace over principle. But I wasn't the same woman I'd been 30 years ago. I called Thomas immediately. Is this legitimate? Can he actually stop me from writing about my own life? Thomas's voice was calm and reassuring. I'll have our legal department look at it, but generally speaking, you have every right to write about your own experiences. Truth is a defense against defamation, and your blog posts are clearly opinion pieces based on your perspective, not attempts to damage his reputation. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the harassment claim? Harder to prove. You're not targeting him personally. You're not encouraging others to contact him. You're simply sharing your own story. From what I can tell, you've been thoughtful about protecting his privacy. You don't use his full name, don't share details about his work or personal life beyond how it relates to your relationship. I felt some of my panic subside, but the letter had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. The idea that my own son would try to legally silence me felt like a betrayal deeper than anything he'd done before. That evening, I wrote one of my most honest posts yet. When your child threatens to sue you for telling your truth. I didn't share details about the legal letter, but I wrote about the pain of being threatened with legal action by someone you'd raised and loved unconditionally. I wrote about the irony of being called crazy for having emotions, then being legally threatened when those emotions led to action. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of comments from readers expressing outrage on my behalf, sharing their own stories of family members who'd tried to silence them through intimidation or manipulation. Several people connected me with organizations that supported women facing legal harassment for speaking out. More importantly, I received a private message from someone unexpected. Iris, she wrote. I need you to know that I disagree with the legal letter. I tried to talk Emory out of it, but he's feeling cornered and is reacting defensively. I don't think you're wrong to write about your experiences, and I don't think you're trying to hurt him. I think you're trying to heal yourself and help other people in the process. I'm sorry this has gotten so ugly. I read her message several times, grateful for the first sign of support from within my own family. Bea had always been the peacemaker, and I knew it had taken courage for her to reach out against her husband's wishes. I wrote back, "Thank you for saying that. I love Emory, and I never intended for this to become a legal battle. I just want him to understand that dismissing my feelings has real consequences, and that I have the right to process those consequences in my own way." Her response came quickly. I'm working on helping him see that. He's scared, I think. Scared that he's not the good person he thought he was. Scared that maybe he has absorbed some unhealthy patterns. Growth is hard at any age. That weekend, Jules's video interview was featured on a major women's lifestyle website, bringing even more attention to my story. I was invited to speak on 2 podcasts and received interest from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to explore stories of older women finding their voices. But the success felt hollow, with the legal threat hanging over my head and my relationship with Emory in ruins. I'd gained a platform and lost my son, and some days the trade-off felt devastating. I was struggling with whether to continue writing when I received an email that changed everything. "Dear Mrs. Calloway," it began, "you don't know me, but I'm a 43-year-old mother of 2 teenage boys. I've been reading your blog since the beginning, and I wanted you to know that it's changed how I parent. After reading your posts about emotional dismissal, I realized I was unconsciously teaching my sons that women's feelings don't matter. When they complain about their girlfriend being dramatic or roll their eyes at my emotional responses, I now stop and have conversations about emotional intelligence and respect. I'm trying to raise boys who won't dismiss the women in their lives the way my generation was taught to do. Your courage to speak up is helping me raise better men. Please don't stop writing. I read the email 3 times, tears streaming down my face. This was bigger than my conflict with Emory, bigger than my own need for validation. This was about breaking cycles, about preventing other mothers from experiencing what I'd experienced. I opened my laptop and began writing. Why I won't let legal threats silence my truth. The post went live that evening, and by morning, it had been shared thousands of times. The hashtag #IrisCalloway's was trending on social media platforms I didn't even understand. Legal advocacy groups were offering to support me pro bono, and women's organizations were reaching out about featuring my story in their publications. I'd become, quite accidentally, a symbol of something larger than my own family drama, and for the first time since receiving that legal letter, I felt strong enough to handle whatever came next. The call came on a Wednesday morning while I was tending to the small herb garden I'd started in my backyard. I'd been spending more time outdoors lately, finding that the physical act of nurturing something helped balance the emotional intensity of my suddenly public life. Mrs. Calloway? The voice was unfamiliar, professional, but warm. This is Patricia Singh from the Portland Tribune. I'm working on a story about your blog and the conversation it started about family dynamics and generational communication. I'd grown more selective about media requests, overwhelmed by the constant attention. But something in Patricia's tone made me pause. I'm primarily interested in the broader social implications, she continued. But in my research, I've discovered something about your family history that I think you should know about before I publish. My stomach dropped. What kind of something? Would it be possible to meet in person? This isn't the kind of conversation I'm comfortable having over the phone. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in downtown Bellmare that afternoon. Patricia turned out to be a woman about my age, with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who'd spent years handling sensitive stories. She ordered coffee for both of us and pulled out a manila folder. Mrs. Calloway, how much do you know about your ex-husband's current life? The question seemed to come from nowhere. Richard, very little. We've been divorced for 30 years. The last I heard, he was living in Sacramento with his second wife. Patricia nodded slowly. I've been researching family dynamics and generational patterns for this article, and I contacted several family members to get different perspectives on your story. Your ex-husband's second wife, Linda, reached out to me after seeing your blog. Linda contacted you? I couldn't hide my surprise. I'd met Richard's second wife exactly once, at Emory's college graduation. She'd seemed pleasant but distant, and we'd barely exchanged 10 words. She wanted me to know something about Richard that she thinks might explain some of the patterns you've written about. Patricia opened the folder carefully. Mrs. Calloway, did you know that Richard's first marriage before you lasted only 18 months? I stared at her. Richard was married before me. Yes, to a woman named Carol Reeves in 1978. She filed for divorce, citing emotional abuse and manipulation. The court records are public. Linda found them when she was doing genealogy research for her children. The words seemed to float around me without landing. Richard had been married before me. In all our years together, through our courtship, marriage, and divorce, he'd never mentioned a previous wife. But that's not all, Patricia continued gently. Linda found Carol Reeves. She's Carol Hansen now, lives in Seattle. Linda reached out to her, and Carol agreed to speak with me. Mrs. Calloway, her description of Richard's behavior during their marriage, is remarkably similar to what you've written about in your blog. Patricia slid a typed transcript across the table. Carol described years of being told she was too sensitive, too emotional, crazy for having normal reactions to his coldness and manipulation. She said he had a talent for making her doubt her own perceptions, for turning her emotions into character flaws. I read Carol's words with a growing sense of recognition and horror. The phrases were eerily familiar. The same dismissive language, the same techniques for deflecting responsibility that I'd endured throughout my marriage to Richard. There's more, Patricia said quietly. Linda suspects this pattern contributed to some of Richard's difficulties with Emory as well. She says Richard has always struggled with emotional intimacy, that he tends to dismiss feelings as weakness in everyone around him. I looked up from the transcript, trying to process what I was learning. Why is Linda sharing this now? Because she's worried about the legal action against you. She thinks Emory may have learned these patterns from his father, and she wanted you to know that you're not crazy, that your perceptions of emotional manipulation were accurate. Patricia paused. She also wanted you to know that she's been reading your blog, and it's helped her understand her own marriage better. I sat in the cafe for a long time after Patricia left, staring at the transcript and trying to reorganize 30 years of memories. So many moments that had left me feeling gaslit and confused suddenly made sense in this new context. Richard hadn't just been emotionally unavailable. He'd been repeating patterns from a previous relationship that had ended because of his inability to validate his partner's emotional reality. More disturbing was the realization that Emory had absorbed these patterns. My son's dismissal of my feelings wasn't just generational misunderstanding or different communication styles. It was learned behavior passed down from a father who'd never taught him that women's emotions deserved respect and consideration. Drove home in a daze, my mind racing through implications I wasn't ready to fully process. That evening I called Mo and read her Patricia's transcript. "Jesus, Iris," she said when I finished. "No wonder you felt like you were losing your mind during that marriage. He was literally using the same playbook he'd used to destroy a previous relationship." "But what does this mean for Emory?" I asked. "If he learned these patterns from Richard, if he doesn't even realize what he's doing, it means he has a chance to change," Mo said firmly. "Unlike his father, he has a mother who's brave enough to call out the behavior instead of just enduring it." That night, I lay awake thinking about cycles of emotional abuse, about how patterns get passed down through generations like toxic heirlooms. I thought about the women who'd commented on my blog, sharing their own stories of being dismissed and diminished by partners and children. How many of them were dealing with learned behaviors that had never been challenged? I also thought about Patricia's article, which would be published the following week. The revelation about Richard's pattern of emotional manipulation would add a new dimension to my story, shifting it from a simple mother-son conflict to a broader examination of how emotional invalidation gets transmitted through families. But first, I needed to process what this meant for my relationship with Emory. Armed with this new understanding, I felt compelled to reach out to him one more time before Patricia's article made everything public. I composed a careful email. "Emory, I've learned some things about your father's history that I think might help explain some of the patterns in our family. I'm not excusing my own mistakes as your mother, but I want you to understand that the dismissive attitude toward emotions that you learned wasn't your fault. It was passed down from patterns that were already broken when I met your father. I love you, and I believe you're capable of breaking these cycles in your own relationships. We don't have to keep repeating the mistakes of previous generations. I attached Carol's transcript and Patricia's preliminary notes, then hit send before I could second-guess myself. Emory's response came 6 hours later. Mom, I don't know what to do with this information. I need time to think. It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but it was the first response that hadn't been defensive or angry. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope that our relationship might be salvageable. Patricia's article was published the following Thursday with the headline, "The Hidden Pattern: How Emotional Invalidation Gets Passed Down Through Generations." It featured my story prominently, but placed it in the broader context of learned behaviors and family systems. The revelation about Richard's previous marriage added weight to my experiences, validating what I'd always suspected but had never been able to prove. That I hadn't been too sensitive or crazy, but rather the victim of a pattern of manipulation that predated our relationship. The article was shared thousands of times and picked up by national media outlets. More importantly, it prompted dozens of similar stories from readers who'd discovered that their experiences of emotional invalidation were part of larger family patterns going back generations. Thomas called within hours of the article's publication. "Iris, this changes everything for the book proposal. You're not just writing a memoir anymore. You're documenting a widespread social problem. Publishers are going to be very interested in this angle." But I barely heard him. I was too focused on a new email that had appeared in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize, but a name that stopped my heart. Carol Hansen. "Dear Iris," it began. "I hope you don't mind that Linda shared your contact information. I wanted to reach out personally after reading your blog and seeing Patricia's article. 30 years ago, I tried to tell people about Richard's emotional manipulation, but no one believed me. I was labeled a bitter ex-wife, someone who couldn't handle marriage. Reading your words has been incredibly validating and incredibly sad because it means he never changed. But I'm also hopeful because your son is young enough to learn different patterns if he chooses to. Thank you for being brave enough to speak your truth. I wish I'd had your courage when I was your age." I read Carol's email 3 times, feeling the profound sadness of recognition mixed with gratitude for her validation. 2 women, 30 years apart, who'd experienced the same patterns of manipulation and dismissal. But this time, instead of suffering in silence, the story was being told and believed. I was responding to Carol when my phone rang. Emory's name on the screen. "Mom?" His voice sounded different, smaller, less certain than usual. "Can we talk? I mean really talk, not fight or argue, just talk?" "Of course, sweetheart. I've been reading everything you sent me, about Dad, about the patterns, about emotional manipulation." He paused. "I think I need to apologize for some things. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe fully." Emory asked to meet in person, suggesting neutral territory, the same Harbor View Café where he'd called me crazy 6 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, and when I mentioned it during our phone call, he gave a rueful laugh. "Maybe it's appropriate," he said. "Full circle and all that." I spent the morning before our meeting trying to prepare emotionally for what felt like the most important conversation we'd had since he was a teenager. I reread some of my early blog posts, remembering the raw hurt and anger that had driven me to start writing. Then I read some of my more recent entries, noting how my voice had evolved from wounded to thoughtful to strong. Mo stopped by an hour before I was supposed to leave, ostensibly to borrow a book, but really to check on my emotional state. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling into her usual kitchen chair. "Nervous, hopeful, terrified. I poured coffee for both of us out of habit. What if this is just another attempt to manipulate me into stopping the blog? What if the legal threat didn't work? So now he's trying a softer approach. Mo studied my face with the careful attention of someone who'd known me through every major life crisis. Do you think that's what this is? I considered the question honestly. No. Something in his voice was different. He sounded younger somehow. Like the boy I used to know before he learned to armor himself with logic and emotional distance. Then, trust that instinct. You've gotten very good at reading emotional manipulation over the past few months. If this feels different, it probably is. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early and chose a corner table with a view of the harbor. The spring afternoon was unusually clear, and sailboats dotted the water like white triangles against the blue. I ordered tea and tried to quiet my racing thoughts. Emory arrived exactly on time, looking rumpled and tired in a way that was uncharacteristic for him. His usual polished appearance had been replaced by jeans and an old sweater, and his hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it. "Hi, Mom." He slid into the seat across from me, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "Hello, sweetheart." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 6 months of conflict hanging between us. Finally, Emory looked up. "I've been doing a lot of reading since you sent me that information about Dad," he said quietly. "About emotional invalidation, about gaslighting, about patterns in families." He paused. "I think I owe you several apologies." I waited, not wanting to interrupt what felt like a carefully prepared speech. "First, I'm sorry for calling you crazy. That was cruel and dismissive, and you didn't deserve it." His voice was steady, but I could see the effort it was taking. "Second, I'm sorry for threatening legal action. I was scared and angry, and I reacted defensively instead of trying to understand your perspective. Thank you," I said simply. "But mostly I'm sorry for years of making you feel like your emotions were inconvenient or irrational. I've been thinking about specific conversations, specific moments when you tried to tell me you were hurt or disappointed, and I dismissed you instead of listening." He rubbed his forehead. "I sound exactly like Dad when I do that, don't I?" The question hung in the air between us. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But you're not your father, Emory. You have the capacity for emotional growth that he never developed." "How do you know that?" "Because you're here. Because you're apologizing. Because you're willing to examine your own behavior instead of just defending it." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "And because I raised you to be better than the patterns you inherited." Emory's eyes filled with tears, something I hadn't seen since he was a child. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom. I don't know how to unlearn 35 years of emotional habits." "The same way you learn them," I said. "One interaction at a time, one conversation at a time, one choice at a time to listen instead of dismiss, to validate instead of minimize." We talked for 2 hours, the longest real conversation we'd had in years. Emory asked questions about my marriage to his father, about moments from his childhood that he was now seeing differently. I shared stories I'd never told him about Richard's emotional manipulation, about how I tried to shield him from the worst of it while not realizing he was absorbing the patterns anyway. "The blog," he said eventually. "Are you going to keep writing it?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Not to hurt you or embarrass you, but because it's helping people. I get messages every day from women who feel less alone because of what I've shared." Emory nodded slowly. I've been reading the comments. Some of them are really powerful. You've been reading the comments? He looked embarrassed. I've been reading everything. Every post, every comment, every article that's referenced your work. I wanted to understand what people were responding to. He paused. I think I get it now. You're not just complaining about me specifically. You're documenting something bigger. Duh, personal is political, I said, quoting a phrase I'd taught to countless students over the years. What happens next? He asked. Thomas, my literary agent, thinks I should turn the blog into a book. There's interest from publishers. A book. Emory absorbed this. About our family. About patterns in families. About emotional invalidation as a form of subtle abuse. About older women finding their voices. I paused. About the possibility of breaking cycles instead of repeating them. Would you want me to read it? Before it's published, I mean. Not to censor it, but to understand it. The offer surprised me. Yes, I'd like that very much. Walked out of the cafe together, and for the first time in months, it felt natural rather than obligatory. Emory hugged me goodbye. Really hugged me. Not the perfunctory embrace we'd been exchanging for years. I love you, Mom, he said. I'm sorry it took me so long to show it in a way you could feel. That evening, I called Thomas to tell him about the conversation. He was thrilled by Emory's apparent change of heart, seeing it as a powerful addition to the book's narrative arc. Publishers love stories of redemption and growth, he said. The fact that your courage to speak out actually improved your relationship with your son. That's a powerful message. It's not completely healed, I cautioned. We have a lot of work to do. Of course, but the trajectory is there. The possibility of change, of breaking generational patterns. That's what makes this more than just a personal memoir. Over the next week, I began outlining the book more seriously. Thomas had been right. There was enough material for a full-length exploration of emotional invalidation in families. The particular challenges facing older women who tried to assert their needs, and the ways that speaking truth could catalyze positive change. I also started receiving different kinds of emails. Instead of just supportive messages from readers, I was hearing from adult children who'd read my story and recognized their own behavior. Several wrote about having difficult conversations with their mothers, about beginning to understand the impact of emotional dismissal they'd never examined before. One message particularly moved me. Dear Mrs. Calloway, I'm a 28-year-old woman who realized after reading your blog that I've been treating my mother the same way your son treated you. I always thought I was being rational when I dismissed her concerns as overreactions. Your writing helped me see that I was actually being cruel. I called my mom yesterday and apologized for years of making her feel like her feelings didn't matter. Thank you for having the courage to hold up a mirror that I didn't even know I needed. The ripple effects of my decision to speak out were becoming visible in ways I'd never anticipated. It wasn't just about my relationship with Emory anymore. It was about challenging a broader cultural pattern of emotional dismissal that affected families everywhere. But the most significant change came 3 weeks after my conversation with Emory, when I received an unexpected email from B. Iris, she wrote, I wanted you to know that something has shifted in our house. Emory has been different since your conversation, more aware of emotional dynamics, more willing to examine his own reactions. Yesterday, he caught himself dismissing my concerns about something and actually stopped mid-sentence to apologize and ask me to explain my perspective. It was a small moment, but it felt huge. I think your courage to speak up is helping him become a better husband, as well as a better son." I read B's message several times, feeling a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. This was what I'd hoped for when I started writing. Not just to be heard, but to create the possibility of change. That evening, I started working on what I knew would be the most difficult chapter of my book. What I wish I'd known about breaking. Generational patterns. It would be my attempt to synthesize everything I'd learned about emotional manipulation, family dynamics, and the courage required to speak truth, even when it disrupted the peace. As I wrote, I thought about all the women who'd reached out to me, all the adult children who were beginning to examine their own behavior, all the families who might avoid repeating the patterns that had caused so much pain. The personal had indeed become political, and my small act of defiance had rippled outward in ways I was still discovering. The call from the publisher came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, exactly 9 months after I'd published my first blog post. Thomas had prepared me for the possibility, but hearing the actual offer still felt surreal. "Iris, are you sitting down?" Thomas's voice buzzed with excitement. "Harper and Row wants to publish your book. They're offering a substantial advance and a 2-book deal." I was sitting in my garden surrounded by the herbs and flowers I'd been tending as a way to stay grounded during the intensity of the past few months. The irony of receiving life-changing news while my hands were literally in the dirt wasn't lost on me. A 2-book deal. They want the memoir about your experience with Emory and family emotional dynamics, but they also want a follow-up book. Maybe a guide for families who want to break these patterns, or a broader exploration of how women can find their voices later in life. I closed my eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. 6 months ago, I'd been a retired teacher whose biggest accomplishment was organizing the local book club's annual fundraiser. Now I was being offered a publishing contract that would make me a professional author. "There's more," Thomas continued. "They want to time the publication with a speaking tour. There's already interest from universities, women's organizations, and family therapy conferences. You've accidentally become an expert on something people desperately need to understand." That afternoon, I called Emory to share the news. Our relationship had been slowly healing since our conversation at the cafe, though we were both being careful not to move too fast or expect too much. "Mom, that's incredible," he said, and I could hear genuine pride in his voice. "A real book. Deal. I'm so proud of you. Are you okay with it? With me writing about our family dynamics publicly?" There was a pause. "I've been thinking about that a lot since we talked. At first, I was embarrassed about being portrayed as the bad guy in your story, but I've come to understand that I wasn't the villain. I was just someone repeating harmful patterns without examining them." He paused. "If our story can help other families recognize and change those patterns before they cause as much damage as they did for us, then I think it's worth the discomfort." His response moved me more than I expected. This was growth in real time, the kind of emotional maturity I'd been hoping he'd develop his entire life. "There's something else," I said. "The publisher wants to include a final chapter about reconciliation and healing. Would you be willing to write something about your perspective on this process? About what you've learned?" "You want me to contribute to the book?" "Only if you're comfortable with it. But I think readers would benefit from hearing how this looks from the other side. How someone recognizes and changes patterns of emotional dismissal." Emory was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I'd like to do that. I think I owe it to other people who might be doing what I was doing without realizing it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of contract negotiations, editorial meetings, and interviews. Media outlets that had previously shown mild interest in my blog were now eager to feature the blogging grandmother who landed a book deal. I found myself on podcasts and morning shows, trying to articulate how a moment of personal pain had evolved into a broader social commentary. But the most meaningful response came from my readers. The blog had grown to over 50,000 regular followers, and the comments section had become a community of people sharing their own stories of emotional healing and family reconciliation. When I announced the book deal, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. "You've given so many of us permission to speak our truth," wrote one regular commenter. "Now you're going to reach even more people who need to hear this message." Jules, who had become something of an unofficial social media manager for my growing platform, organized a virtual celebration that brought together readers from around the world. Seeing faces on my computer screen, people of all ages who'd found meaning in my words, drove home the reality that this had become much larger than my personal story. The most challenging part of the book process was working with the editor, a sharp woman named Sarah, who pushed me to dig deeper into the psychological and sociological implications of my experience. "You mentioned that Richard had been married before, and that his first wife experienced similar patterns of emotional invalidation," Sarah said during one of our video calls. "But you don't fully explore what this suggests about how these behaviors develop and persist." She was right. I'd been so focused on my own healing that I hadn't fully examined the broader systems that created and perpetuated emotional manipulation. Sarah encouraged me to research the psychology of gaslighting, the sociology of gendered emotional labor, and the intergenerational transmission of trauma. "Your story is powerful because it's personal," she said, "but it will be important because it connects individual experience to larger patterns that affect millions of families." The research phase was both enlightening and disturbing. I learned about studies showing how emotional invalidation in childhood leads to anxiety and depression in adulthood. I read about the ways that patriarchal social structures teach men to devalue emotional intelligence while simultaneously expecting women to manage all emotional labor in relationships. Most significantly, I discovered research on how these patterns could be interrupted and changed through awareness, therapy, and intentional practice of emotional validation. The academic literature confirmed what I'd intuited through my own experience, that speaking truth about emotional manipulation was often the first step toward healing. Emory surprised me by throwing himself into the research as well. He read psychology books about emotional development, attended therapy sessions to work on his own patterns, and even reached out to his father to have difficult conversations about their relationship. "Dad was defensive at first," he told me, during one of our weekly check-ins. "But when I explained that I wasn't blaming him, just trying to understand how certain patterns developed, he was more open. He actually admitted that he'd never learned healthy ways to deal with emotions, that his own father had been completely emotionally unavailable." "How did that feel?" I asked. "Sad, mostly, and relieved. It helped me understand that this isn't personal failings on anyone's part. It's learned behavior that gets passed down until someone decides to examine it and change it." The book came together over the summer, with chapters alternating between my personal narrative and broader analysis of family emotional dynamics. Emory's contribution, a raw, honest exploration of recognizing and changing patterns of emotional dismissal, became one of the strongest parts of the manuscript. By August, we had a completed draft that Sarah and the editorial team believed could make a real impact. The publication date was set for the following spring, with a publicity campaign that would include television interviews, speaking engagements, and a multi-city book tour. But before any of that happened, I wanted to share the news with the person who'd been most instrumental in my journey. I drove to Carol Hansen's house in Seattle on a warm Saturday afternoon, carrying an advance copy of the book. Carol, now in her early 70s, greeted me with the warmth of someone who understood my story from the inside. We sat in her garden, drinking iced tea and talking about the strange paths that had led us both to this moment. When I left Richard all those years ago, I felt like I was the only person who'd experienced that kind of emotional manipulation, she said, turning the book over in her hands. I spent years wondering if I'd imagined it, if I'd been too sensitive or demanding, and now I know that speaking up was the right thing to do, even though no one believed me at the time. She smiled. Your courage to tell this story publicly is validating something I've carried alone for 30 years. That evening, I sat in my hotel room overlooking Elliott Bay, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 9 months ago, I'd been a quiet retiree whose greatest fear was becoming irrelevant. Now I was about to publish a book that could potentially help thousands of families recognize and change harmful patterns. The personal had become political in ways I'd never imagined, and my small act of rebellion had grown into something that felt much larger than myself. I called Mo to share the day's conversations with Carol. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Emory hadn't called you crazy that day? She asked. I considered the question seriously. I think I would have eventually found my voice some other way. The hurt and anger had been building for years. That moment was just the catalyst that finally pushed me to speak up. Well, I'm grateful for the catalyst, Mo said. The world needs more women willing to tell their truth, regardless of who it makes uncomfortable. As I prepared for bed, I thought about all the women who'd reached out to me over the past months, all the families who were having difficult but necessary conversations because of my willingness to break the silence. Tomorrow I would fly home to Bellmare and continue preparing for a book launch that would push my story into an even larger arena. But tonight, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I'd found my voice at exactly the moment when I was brave enough to use it. The book launch event was held at Powell's Books in Portland on a crisp October evening, exactly 1 year after I'd started my blog. Thomas had arranged for a reading and discussion, but neither of us had anticipated the crowd that showed up. The bookstore's event space was packed, with additional seating set up in the aisles and people standing along the walls. I looked out at the audience from behind the podium, seeing faces I recognized from my blog's comment section, mixed with strangers who'd heard about the book through media coverage. In the front row sat Mo, beaming with pride, next to Emory and Bea. The sight of my son in the audience, supportive rather than defensive, still felt like a small miracle. 18 months ago, I thought my story was over, I began, my voice steady despite my nerves. I was a retired teacher living quietly in a small coastal town, certain that my years of having anything meaningful to contribute were behind me. Then my son called me crazy for crying, and I discovered that sometimes our most painful moments can become doorways to our most authentic selves. I read excerpts from several chapters, including parts of Emory's contribution, about recognizing and changing patterns of emotional dismissal. When I looked up after reading his words about learning to validate rather than minimize his wife's concerns, I saw him wiping tears from his eyes. The Q&A session afterward was lively and emotional, with audience members sharing their own stories of family healing and personal growth. A woman in her 80s talked about finally confronting her adult daughter's dismissive behavior. A middle-aged man asked advice about breaking patterns of emotional unavailability he'd learned from his father. But the question that moved me most came from a young woman who looked to be about Jules's age. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "what would you say to someone who's afraid to speak their truth because they're worried about disrupting family relationships?" I thought carefully before answering. "I'd say that relationships built on avoiding truth aren't as stable as they appear. When we silence ourselves to keep peace, we're often just postponing necessary conflicts while sacrificing our own emotional well-being." I paused. Sometimes disruption is the price of authenticity, and sometimes authenticity is the price of genuine intimacy. After the event, there was a small reception where I signed books and talked with readers. The conversations ranged from heartbreaking to hopeful, with people sharing how the themes in my book had resonated with their own experiences. Emory approached me as the evening was winding down. "Mom, I wanted to thank you." For what? For not giving up on me. For believing I could change even when I wasn't sure I could change myself. He glanced around at the departing crowd. "All these people who've been helped by your story, that only happened because you were brave enough to speak up even when it made me angry. You did the hard work of listening and growing," I said. "I just provided the catalyst." Still, he hugged me, and it felt like the embrace of the son I'd always hoped he could become. "I'm proud of you. Not just tonight, but for everything you've accomplished this year." The book's reception exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 2 weeks, it had climbed onto several bestseller lists, and requests for speaking engagements were pouring in from across the country. Reading groups were choosing it for discussion. Therapy professionals were recommending it to clients, and universities were incorporating it into courses on family dynamics and women's studies. But the response that meant the most to me came in the form of letters and emails from readers whose families had been changed by the book's message. A grandmother in Texas wrote about her grandson apologizing for years of dismissing her concerns. A middle-aged woman in Maine described having her first honest conversation with her mother in decades. Jules organized a virtual book club discussion that brought together readers from around the world, creating an online community focused on emotional healing and family reconciliation. Watching their faces on my computer screen, people of all ages and backgrounds, united by a commitment to breaking harmful patterns, I felt the profound satisfaction of work that had transcended personal grievance to become genuinely helpful. The speaking tour took me to cities I'd never visited, universities I'd only dreamed of seeing, and conferences where my story was placed alongside research on trauma recovery and family systems therapy. Each event brought new conversations, new insights, and new connections with people doing similar work in their own families and communities. 6 months after publication, I received a letter that brought everything's full circle. It was from Patricia Singh, the journalist whose article about generational patterns had helped validate my experiences. "Dear Iris," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that my article about your family's story has led to my own research project on emotional invalidation in families. I'm working on a documentary that will feature your story alongside others, exploring how patterns of manipulation get transmitted and how they can be interrupted. Would you be interested in participating?" I said yes immediately. The documentary, tentatively titled Breaking the Silence: Women Who Refuse to be Dismissed, would bring together stories from multiple generations of women who'd found the courage to speak their truth despite family pressure to remain quiet. But perhaps the most meaningful development came during a family dinner at Emory and Bee's house that spring. We were celebrating Bee's birthday, and the conversation turned to emotional intelligence and parenting as they discussed their plans to start a family. I want to make sure our kids grow up understanding that emotions are information, not weakness, Emory said, passing salad around the table. I want them to know that listening to someone's feelings isn't the same as agreeing with them, but it's still essential. You'll be great parents, I said, meaning it completely. We'll make mistakes, Bee added, but hopefully different mistakes than previous generations. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. From that painful moment in Harbor View Café to this dinner table conversation about breaking generational patterns. It felt like traveling between different worlds, though only 18 months had passed. The blog continued to grow, now featuring guest posts from other women sharing their stories of finding their voices later in life. The book was being translated into several languages, reaching audiences I'd never imagined. And I was working on the second book in my contract, a guide for families who wanted to create more emotionally healthy dynamics. But the most satisfying part of my new life was the simplest. I no longer felt invisible or irrelevant. At 68, I had found work that mattered, a voice that reached people who needed to hear it, and a relationship with my son that was based on mutual respect rather than dutiful obligation. That night, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, listening to the sound of waves that had always comforted me. The herbs I'd planted were thriving, and the notebook where I'd first started documenting my experiences lay open on the table beside me, now filled with ideas for new writing projects. Thought about the scared, hurt woman who'd started typing, "My son called me crazy for crying," on her laptop 18 months earlier. She couldn't have imagined that her pain would become a doorway to purpose, that her decision to speak truth would ripple outward to touch thousands of lives. But maybe that's how transformation always happens, not through grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but through small acts of courage that accumulate over time until they become something larger than we ever imagined possible. The waves continued their eternal rhythm, and I began planning my next chapter. The clink of her teacup against the saucer had become the new sound of ritual, the moment each morning when Iris Calloway reminded herself she was no longer invisible. The bird song outside her Seaview Lane cottage was the same. The waves still played their lullaby across the sand, and the light still filtered through her kitchen window in long, painterly streaks. But she had changed. She had been invited to speak at the Midwest Women's Conference in Minneapolis, the first of many stops on what her publisher referred to as the Intimate Truth Circuit, a series of carefully selected appearances designed to connect her story with audiences hungry for vulnerability, honesty, and emotional wisdom. Iris, still unsure of how one transforms from a coastal town retiree to a voice of a movement, packed her carry-on with modest layers, a leather-bound journal, and a copy of her own book that she hadn't yet found the courage to read aloud in full. At the airport, a young woman approached her near the gate. "You're Iris Calloway, right?" the woman asked, holding her phone like a compass. "I read your blog all through quarantine. My mom and we talk now, because of you." Iris had been growing used to this. Small moments of recognition, not from fame, but from connection. She smiled softly and thanked the woman, then walked to her gate with a new kind of weight, not of burden, but of responsibility. The conference was larger than Iris had anticipated. Over 700 attendees had gathered in a hotel ballroom, a tapestry of generations. Women in their 20s, seated beside women in their 70s, granddaughters next to their grandmothers, all bound by a shared thread of emotional inheritance. When she took the stage, the applause startled her, but what overwhelmed her more than the noise was the silence that followed. That deep, collective pause of people ready to truly listen. "I'm not here to tell you how to fix your families," Iris began. "I'm here to show you what happened when I stopped fixing mine." She spoke for nearly 40 minutes about how silence had protected her son's feelings but slowly buried her own. About the letter from her ex-husband's first wife. About the ripple effect of one woman speaking up in a world that teaches women, especially aging women, to quiet down. Afterward, dozens stood in line to speak to her. One was a therapist from New Jersey who said her clients now quoted Iris's blog in group sessions. Another was a school counselor who had created a reading circle using passages from Iris's story to help teenage girls talk about their mothers. "I think I accidentally started a curriculum," Iris joked to Thomas, her agent, when she returned to her hotel room. "You didn't start a curriculum," Thomas replied over Zoom. "You started a mirror, and people are ready to look into it." As the tour continued, Chicago, Dallas, Phoenix, San Diego, Iris noticed a shift. These weren't just readers. These were participants. Women who came not only to hear her speak, but to speak themselves. At every event, Iris reserved 10 minutes at the end for open mic truths, and soon those 10 minutes became 30. Kiana, Atlanta, a woman in her 50s read a letter she'd written, but never sent to her mother. In Salt Lake City, a grandmother spoke of the guilt she carried for repeating the patterns she never understood were toxic. In Boston, a teenager stood up and said, "I now know how to stop myself before I call my mom too much. Thank you." She filled 3 notebooks in the first month. Not with her own writing, but with stories, names, and quiet revolutions whispered to her in book-signing lines, on red-eye flights, or in coffee shop corners by people who saw her and felt seen. The road was exhausting. The hotels, unfamiliar. But Iris had never felt more awake. In mid-April, her publisher arranged an appearance at her former high school, Bellmare High, the place where Iris had taught for 35 years, where she'd learned how to listen, how to see what wasn't being said between the lines of student essays. The gym had been transformed into an auditorium, and seated among rows of students were some of her former colleagues, including Mo, who now referred to herself as your roadie/biographer. The moment Iris stepped onto the makeshift stage, her breath caught in her throat. The school looked the same. Outdated bleachers, faint smell of gym mats. But she had become someone different within these familiar walls. "You used to tell us that every sentence needed a reason to be written," said a young woman during Q&A. "Do you feel like your blog was the first time you wrote for yourself?" "Yes," Iris answered without hesitation. "And for all of you, too." After the talk, a group of teachers asked if they could adapt parts of her blog into a curriculum for social-emotional literacy. It would be used in English and health classes as a way to help students better understand emotional labor, communication, and intergenerational trauma. Iris agreed, with tears she no longer apologized for. One of the more unexpected stops was Sacramento. She hadn't visited the city in decades, not since the divorce. Her publisher had booked a small venue inside an independent bookstore. An intimate event, they called it. She hesitated about attending. The past was heavy there. But Iris decided to go, if only to reclaim it on her own terms. As she finished, reading a chapter titled "The Cost of Quiet," a woman in the front row stood up. "I'm Linda," she said. "Richard's second wife." The room went still. Linda approached Iris after the event, her face kind, aged differently than Iris's, but with the same soft lines earned from years of holding back emotion. "I thought you deserved to know," Linda said. "He's not well, and I think he's started to understand what he did, not just to you or Carol, but to all of us." Iris wasn't sure what to say. She had not written the book for Richard or for revenge, but it mattered to hear that acknowledgement was happening, even if it came decades late. Before leaving, Linda pressed something into Iris's hand. It was a letter, not from Richard, from Carol. "She wanted you to have this," Linda said, "for when you were ready." That night, Iris sat alone in her hotel room and opened the letter. Carol's handwriting was neat, deliberate. "Iris, when I first read your blog, I felt grief for the woman I had been, and pride for the woman you had become. We both lived under the same cloud, but you found a way to speak through the fog. Thank you for writing what I could not. Thank you for helping me forgive myself. Carol," Iris cried without shame. These were not tears of regret or sadness, but release. Proof that even stories buried for decades could be unearthed and healed. By the third month of the tour, something unexpected began to happen. Men started coming. At first, just a few. Husbands attending with wives, sons accompanying their mothers. But soon, they began raising their hands during Q&As. I never realized how often I made my wife feel small when I thought I was being rational. "I called my mom last night and asked if she ever felt unheard. She cried for 5 minutes before, saying yes. I read your book, so I could understand why my daughter is mad at me. Now I do." The men didn't dominate the space. They came with humility. Many had tears in their eyes. Some brought notebooks. This, Iris realized, was a deeper kind of success. The quiet undoing of inherited behavior. The slow re-education of a generation that had confused stoicism with strength and had raised children in its image. She began adding an optional breakout session at the end of each event titled "Listening Without Fixing." It became one of the most attended segments. By June, Iris had been invited to deliver the keynote at the National Family Dynamics Conference in Maine. It was the largest audience yet. Over 2,000 people. Researchers, therapists, parents, educators. Her talk was titled, "When Women Stop Whispering, The Power of Emotional Truth in Family Systems." She spoke of how silence preserves dysfunction, how truth-telling doesn't destroy families. It reveals what was already broken, and how healing doesn't begin with agreement, but acknowledgement. Midway through her speech, she looked out into the audience and spotted Emory. He had flown in from New York without telling her, wanting to be there not as a family member, but as a supporter. He stood and clapped when she finished, tears on his cheeks. The crowd gave a standing ovation, but her eyes were only on him. Afterward, he approached her backstage. "You're not just my mom anymore," he said. "You're a movement." Iris returned to Seaview Lane that summer with a suitcase full of journals, a calendar full of future engagements, and a heart that was finally full without being heavy. But her story wasn't finished. The tour had changed the world's view of her. Now she was ready to change how she saw herself, not just as a survivor of silence, but as the architect of something new. In the quiet that followed, she would begin the next chapter. What it means to live after your truth has been heard. By the time the speaking tour ended, Iris had collected more than applause. She had gathered stories, fierce, fragile, urgent stories, and realized that though Her words had opened a door. What lay beyond it belonged to many, and now, back in Bellmare, she was ready to step into something deeper, not just telling her story, but helping others write theirs. Her small Seaview Lane cottage hadn't changed. Same wind-worn shingles, same hydrangea bush that bloomed just before summer solstice. But she had changed. She moved through the rooms like someone returned from sea, sunburned and wiser, ready to unpack not just her suitcase, but her legacy. One of the first things Iris did when she returned was host a gathering at the local community center. Nothing fancy. No publisher or press, just a circle of folding chairs, a pot of coffee, and a sign that read, "Telling the Truth, a workshop for women finding their voice." 12 women came. Mo, of course, arrived early with lemon bars and a clipboard. There were 3 teachers, 2 grandmothers, 1 widow, and a single mom who brought her daughter and sat in the back until Iris invited the girl to the circle. "Just listen," she said gently. "That's where stories begin." The women spoke, cautiously at first, about unspoken disappointments, about sons who didn't call, about fathers who had taught them silence by example. But as the circle grew more comfortable, their words flowed freer. By the end of the session, the single mom stood and read a piece about being called dramatic for asking to be treated with kindness. Every woman in the room cried. Iris realized this was what she wanted next. Not more stages, but more circles. With help from Thomas and a grant provided by a non-profit dedicated to intergenerational healing, Iris formed a small organization called Second Sound, a collective offering, writing workshops, virtual circles, and small scholarships to women over 50 starting memoir projects. The premise was simple. Older women have lived the stories worth telling, but few have been given the tools, time, or permission to write them. The first class filled in 4 hours. Within months, she had a waiting list. Jules Nakayama, who had once invited her onto a humble YouTube channel, now worked with her to manage Second Sound's digital programs. Together they created a guided journal series called Letters to the Me Who Stayed Quiet. Mo became the program's resident poetry coach, conducting Zoom sessions where retired librarians and factory workers read verse to each other as if they were performing on Broadway. Every Tuesday night, Iris would log on from her cottage, mug of tea in hand, and read the opening prompt aloud. What did you want to say, and to whom, but didn't? The answers, typed, whispered, cried, were everything. Emory had continued his quiet evolution. Therapy had become a regular part of his life. He and Bea had begun couples counseling, not because they were on the brink, but because they wanted to learn how to listen to each other earlier, better. When Iris invited him to co-lead a workshop for adult children titled How to Hear Your Parents Without Losing Yourself, he hesitated. People might think I'm a fraud. He admitted. No, Iris said, you'll be a mirror. Like I was. They held the first workshop at a retreat center outside Seattle. 10 participants. A weekend of slow, difficult honesty. At one point, a man in his 30s turned to Emory and said, I treated my mom like her needs were an inconvenience. I thought I was being mature. I was just scared. Emory listened. He nodded. Then, quietly, me too. The workshop became a semi-annual event. Not therapy, not confession. Just a space where people unlearned the idea that being emotionally detached was strength, and learned how to speak, hear, and stay in the room anyway. One cool September afternoon, Iris received a call from Bea. I wanted to tell you in person, she said, her voice lilting with joy. We're expecting. Iris felt her heart lift in that tender, familiar ache, joy braided with awe. When Emory came over later that week, they sat on her porch, watching seagulls bicker over crusts of bread. I want to do it differently, he said. Not just parenting, everything. I want this child to grow up knowing emotions are allowed. I think they already will, Iris said, placing her hand over his. Because you've learned how to honor yours. That night she pulled out a letter she had written more than a year ago, never mailed. Dear Emory, there is so much I've never said, so much I protected you from, perhaps too well. If I could do it over, I would speak up sooner. Not to, scold you, but to teach you that women's emotions are not threats. They're signals. They're songs. I am not your burden. I am your blueprint, imperfect though I may be. May your child know the difference between silence and peace. Mom, she never gave it to him. She no longer needed to. His second book was, published the following spring. The Pattern and the Pause, a guide to changing emotional inheritance. It was part memoir, part workbook, part manifesto. It was a quiet hit. Therapists kept copies in waiting rooms. Mothers gifted it to their daughters. Sons mailed it home with notes that read, I'm learning. But for Iris, legacy wasn't in the sales or speeches. It was in the Tuesday night Zoom circles, in the letter from a woman who left an emotionally abusive marriage after reading her book, in the workshop where a father apologized to his grown daughter for always cutting her off when she cried. It was in knowing that a generation of women had begun to speak louder, not to shout, but to stop whispering. One final morning, with the sea wind curling around her garden, Iris opened a fresh notebook and wrote a letter. To the woman I was, you were never crazy. You were never irrational. You were carrying grief without language. That heaviness in your chest was not weakness. It was the silence of unspoken truth. You worried about being difficult when all you wanted was to be heard. You protected people from your feelings, until your body became the cage for what your mouth was not allowed to say. But you never gave up. You cried in a cafe and called it the beginning. You wrote yourself back into the world. Thank you for not disappearing. Thank you for telling the truth, even when it cost you comfort. You gave us a life we didn't know we could have. Iris, as the waves rolled in on her 71st birthday, Iris Calloway sat in the quiet of her kitchen, a quiet that was no longer filled with tension but with peace. On the fridge were photos, her workshop groups, Bee's ultrasound, Mo in a ridiculous party hat, Emory holding a copy of Late Bloomer like a proud first grader. She looked at them, smiled and opened her laptop. The cursor blinked. Patient as ever, she began typing. I never meant to become a revolution. I just wanted to be heard. And the world kept listening. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.